Perfect. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Government Transparency in Marine Fisheries. What role does it play for fish trade and eco certification? This webinar is jointly organized by the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management and the Fisheries Transparency Initiative. Now, as you can see from this rather long title of the webinar, we are going to talk about the link between two major aspects in fisheries. And that is, on the one hand, market-based mechanism, such as the certification of seafood as well as trading of fish products. And on the other hand, public access to government information on how national authorities are managing the fishery sector. Each of those are already huge topics in itself, but we're going to try to discuss the link between these two aspects today. My name is Sven Biermann. I'm the Executive Director of the Fisheries Transparency Initiative, and one of my main jobs as the moderator of this webinar today is to make sure that we're not drifting too much into each of these topics individually, but really trying to stay on course and discussing the connections between market-based mechanisms on the one side and government transparency on the other side. And the reason why we set this webinar up is actually quite straightforward. We have seen some impressive advancements on governments making information about marine fisheries more accessible, more credible, and also more usable for its citizens, business partners, and other relevant stakeholders. And the Fisheries Transparency Initiative and its partners have played a role in this particular point. But if we want to make government transparency in fisheries the global norm, we have to continuously work on strengthening the positive aspects of transparency. And that has to be seen beyond the traditional arguments of better decision-making, enhancing effective oversight and accountability. And just to be clear and not being misunderstood, effective governance of a sector is already, a powerful tool if it is embraced effectively, and it's a key success factor for achieving sustainable marine fisheries. So in itself, that is already a convincing argument. But we also have to acknowledge that governments around the world, in particular when it comes to fisheries and wider ocean management, have a lot on their plate these days, from climate change to pollution to overfishing, unequal benefit sharing. So transparency, if it is just argued from a good governance point of view, may not be enough to convince all national authorities to embrace this even further. So the question is then, how can we nudge governments? How can we motivate governments more to enhance transparency in fisheries? And that is exactly what we're trying to do in this particular webinar. So I'm very pleased that we have an absolute stellar lineup of international experts to talk about their experience, how economic incentives stemming in particular from these two aspects, third-party certification of fish and seafood, as well as international trade, can stimulate national authorities to improve transparency of fisheries management. Now, before we jump in, the usual few logistical remarks. First, as you may have heard at the beginning, the meeting is being recorded, and we will make a link of this recording publicly available within the next few days on social media. Second, just to be very clear, all speakers have kindly agreed just to be introduced very briefly. So we're not going through their extremely impressive vitas, but in the interest of time, we're going to do the introduction very quickly. And thirdly, all of the participants are highly encouraged to ask questions, to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer all of these questions throughout this webinar. And if we have time at the end, we will also bring up a few of those questions and put them forward to the panelists. But let's get started. Enough of myself, and I'm very happy and I feel very privileged that we have Ambassador Lindstedt with us here today to set the scene. For us, Ms. Anna Lindstedt is the ambassador for the ocean from the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I would say that by this role and by this title alone, it emphasizes the importance that Sweden places on the ocean. So Ambassador Lindstedt, it is great to have you here today, and the virtual floor is yours. It looks like the picture is frozen. Is that the same for the others? Yeah. Okay. And let me see if we have Ambassador. Can you hear us? Maybe it works if we turn off the video. Yeah. Doesn't seem like this. This sometimes happens in the developed world. So we may have to improvise a little bit. That is no problem, and we'll see if we can get the ambassador back in. So we will jump right away then into the panelists. As you've seen from the introduction, we have three fantastic panelists with us today. And since we are talking about government transparency, it makes the most sense to start with the panelist that is coming from the government. And that is Mr. Roy Claris from the government of Seychelles. Roy is the Principal Secretary of Fisheries at the Ministry of Fisheries and Blue Economy. Ambassador? I can hear you, but the picture is still frozen. So maybe, Ambassador, if you turn off the video and we'll just focus on the audio, then we'll get a better signal. See if that works. This is the beauty of doing live webinars. Okay, no, I think we'll have to wait. So we'll do Roy's intervention first, and then if we hear the ambassador afterwards, then we'll bring her back in. So let me just mute ambassador. Okay, so Roy, if we can start with you. The Seychelles is not only known for being a global tourist hotspot due to its absolute stunning natural beauty, but Seychelles is also extremely dependent on its marine fishery sector. Sometimes called a tuna country. And at the moment, there are several certification assessments for fisheries ongoing in the Seychelles, and I believe they're all tuna related, as well as various, I'm not sure how many, fisheries improvement projects aimed at enhancing fisheries. So why are these efforts currently ongoing in the Seychelles? What is Seychelles expecting from these kind of certification efforts?
Thank you, Sven, and good afternoon from Seychelles to all participants and panelists as well. Sven, to start with, let me give a brief introduction of the Seychelles fisheries itself. As you all know, Seychelles, as a small island developing state, we are very limited in terms of economic opportunities. And besides tourism, our main economic sector is fisheries, which is the second pillar of the economy. And the tuna industry is the most significant in terms of direct and indirect returns to the economy. To put it in context, tuna fisheries makes a substantial contribution to the Seychelles economy, and it is the top exporter of products from Seychelles. And the revenue that is generated from the tuna sector plays a crucial role in supporting the economic stability of the country. And this complements what we derive from the tourism sector in terms of foreign exchange earnings. Besides, in Seychelles, fish is our primary source of protein. It serves as our staple diet. It contributes to our local food security, access to nutrition, employment, amongst others. And besides all this, geographically, we sit in the middle of the tuna fishing ground in the Western Indian Ocean. And we have also one of the biggest tuna processing plants in Seychelles. So yes, in terms of the tuna sector, it is very important. It is very important for us in Seychelles. In terms of the expected benefit from certification efforts, like you have alluded to, yes, we do have several ongoing certification efforts. And as certification effort comes with strict regulation that promote responsible fishing, we believe by adhering to these standards, we can also contribute towards the conservation of marine resources and its ecosystem for future generation to come. And with that, because FIT is all about transparency and having certification as well, as a responsible fishing nation, it also enhances our reputation. And this can benefit us by attracting investment, partnership, collaboration, and basically engagement with other nations which are interested in fisheries management. So these are some of the benefits. And for us, we also believe that it can enhance our long-term economic sustainability of the Seychelles fisheries. As you know, Seychelles is one of the most environmentally conscious countries. We are working on a fisheries and a management plan for our whole exclusive economic zone. And we believe having these certification processes also shows that we can also meet market demand and market standards. And this can lead to stable streams of revenue, continuous stable streams of revenue from our fisheries, and can also allow us to tap into a wider consumer base, attract other markets, and command a premium price to boost not only from the income or revenue from the industrial tuna sector, but also income from our local fishermen in the national economy. So these are but a few of the expected benefits. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. This is quite interesting. And I think one of the points that I would like to come back maybe a little bit later is this, I don't know if it's a dilemma, but I feel there's a certain aspect to be considered between having certifications to meet demand from markets, as you said, and basically having certifications for trading and exporting, and at the same time keeping an eye on the local demand, the need for food and nutrition security from fish and fisheries products. We can come later to that, because one of the follow-up questions that I have for you is, now that you have these certifications going on in the country and FIPS going on at the moment, being one of the leading countries when it comes to public access to information, a leading FITI implementing country. I know it's early in the process, but have you already seen positive aspects of being a transparent country, and has that already helped to ease sometimes the burden of the certification efforts?
Yes, it does. We are slowly seeing the benefit, and it truly does enhance the process, because when you have the information already at hand, it makes it very easy for the assessor to access. In terms of the certification process, like you have mentioned, we have several ongoing assessments. We have 3 clients now that are doing full MSc assessment, while we have an additional 4 for comprehensive fisheries improvement project, FIPS. Of course, all aiming at enhancing the fishing practices. During these endeavors, what we have experienced as Seychelles, from publishing our FITI report every year, which is done by the National Multi-Stakeholders Group, we have seen an increasing use in the use of this report by the certified authority, in particular, when they are scoring MSc principles, especially principles on effective management and effective harvest strategy and control. And what we have also observed as part of this certification process is that our FITI reports have been frequently cited, and it supports the rationale for scoring, because it also demonstrates a direct influence on the scoring process. And it's sort of part of a validation process, as well as the information that we are publishing in the FITI report are vetted by multi-stakeholders. So they are credible information. It's not only information coming directly from the authority, because when these information are in the public domain, it is there for public vetting to ensure that it is credible, it is accurate as well. So by having this information in the public domain, it has made it quicker for the assessors to get to this information. They are readily available. And it also helps us as the authority to keep updating this information as we go along. And this has been a strength for us, actually, in managing our national fisheries systems, because it has kept us on our toe. So in summary, what I would say is that what we are seeing is that transparency due to the FIPTI implementation is also beginning to demonstrate that there are measurable impacts when it comes to MSc assessment. And of course, it is obviously not going to replace eco-label assessment, as these assessments are still huge endeavors for fishers. But what we believe it will do, it is a justification. It justifies the scoring system and the overall environment for certification and transparency. We have seen that on us, it does have a positive impact. And that is a strong message that we should be appealing for other countries that are seeking certification, that this process actually helps and benefits a lot. Thank you, Sven.
Thanks, Roy. I think there's quite a bit that we can work on a little bit later in terms of the influence on scoring, costs, timing, credibility, etc. And it would be, I think it's a great way for Lisa later to maybe pick up on that a little bit. But I'm trying to call Sweden again to see if Ambassador Lindstedt is now on the line. So, Ambassador, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Perfect. That sounds fantastic. So it's a pleasure to have you with us. And if you could, set a little bit the scene for us on Sweden's role when it comes to ocean governance, that would be much appreciated.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Dear all, thank you for joining us here today to discuss an important topic, the economic benefits of transparency in fisheries governance. I'm very pleased to be part of this seminar hosted by the Fisheries Transparency Initiative and the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. In my role as Sweden's ambassador for the ocean, I support all efforts to promote transparency within fisheries. In Sweden, transparency is a cornerstone of our democratic system and a fundamental part of our constitution. Governments, including Sweden's, spend a lot of money managing their fisheries, but the level of transparency of fisheries management systems varies greatly worldwide. A rich body of literature describes how transparency is a tool to improve democracy and opportunities for influence. Less has been written about the economic benefits associated with transparent government in general, and even less about the economic benefits of transparency in the management of fisheries. This is why the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management, SWAM, and the Fisheries Transparency Initiative, FITI, have cooperated to launch this study, Benefits of Government Transparency in Marine Fisheries according to the FITI standard for eco-certification of fisheries, which is the starting point for today's discussion. Well, we're already into the discussion, actually. Its aim was to broaden the international discussion on the benefits of transparency by illuminating the connection between transparency and eco-certification. Result from the study indicates that the two tools, certification of fisheries and government transparency, reinforce one another in the struggle for sustainable fisheries. Increased government transparency in fisheries, in line with the FITI standards, would most likely be beneficial for certification processes for seafood products. According to the study, 94% of the interviewed and surveyed stakeholders view a more transparent fishing management body as beneficial for eco-certification initiatives. 70% of these stakeholders indicated that they consider the level of transparency of the management body when calculating the cost of the fisheries assessment process. People who were interviewed and participated in the online survey consisted of experts with experiences of different parts of the eco-certification process. Fish and other forms of blue food contribute to health for both people and ecosystems. Eco-certification is key to achieving more sustainable blue food systems through the value chains. But efficient eco-certification requires transparency. To sum up, transparency can be key to foster economic prosperity, not least in the context of fisheries, and promote environmental sustainability as well as global cooperation. As we look toward the future, let us reaffirm our dedication to transparency and to improving the sustainability of our fisheries, and work together to ensure the health and prosperity of our ocean and our global community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Landstedt, not only for those opening remarks, but also for the support of Sweden in this particular study, which, as you mentioned, will hopefully serve as a starting point between the link of these two aspects. And for the participants that are interested in this study, you can find it on the FITI website. You can find it on the website of the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. But I particularly liked, Ambassador, one aspect that you mentioned quite early in your remarks, and that is the importance of transparency for democracy and for democratic participation. And if you allow me, I want to take a bit more advantage of you being with us here today. This week we have the UN General Assembly in New York, and one of the messages that we're receiving from New York is that we, on all levels, are failing to achieve the sustainable development goals, and that includes the SDG 14 concerning the ocean. Now, this is obviously rather worrisome, but sometimes one aspect that I feel is forgotten is that the SDGs don't only come with goals and targets for particular thematic objectives, such as the fight against hunger, reduction of poverty, gender inequality, etc. But the SDGs also come with a toolbox, which is summarized in SDG 17. So while the discussions with our panelists are going to focus more on economic incentives, hard facts and regulations, but given that the SDGs and the SDG 17 is focusing, well, one aspect there is on multi-stakeholder collaboration, which is often referred to as more of a soft factor. It would be interesting to hear from your diplomatic perspective, how much does trust matter for these kind of stakeholder collaboration and the role of transparency, in particular when it comes to comparing that against regulations, incentives, laws, and policies, things that are more referred to as hard factors.
Thank you for the question. I'm convinced that all processes, from local to global, require trust. We have seen that so many times. I don't think I need to give any example. But in order to build trust, we need stakeholder participation. But this also needs to be done in an inclusive and transparent manner. And this goes for both the decision-making process as such. I mean, when we make the laws, when we make the regulations, but also, and maybe even more importantly, in the long-term implementation of the laws, regulations, and other decisions. Agenda 2030, we should, I mean, it goes without saying, but sometimes we need to remind ourselves that it's about economic, it has three pillars: economic, social, and environmental sustainability. But in order for sustainability to be sustainable, we have to have an inclusive process. And an inclusive process does not work without transparency. And that's why SDG 17 is about not only stakeholder collaboration as a tool, but also about public access to information. And as you know, and I've already mentioned it, that this transparency and freedom of speech and expression is enshrined in our constitution since the many hundreds of years back, and we wanted to be that way, to stay that way, and especially in a world with increasing confrontation and tension. I think it's even more important to underline the importance of transparency, and in all processes. I mean, at the local level as well as at the national, regional, but not least at the global level. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. This is, I think, extremely powerful, and it's also one of the aspects that we're trying to emphasize more when it comes to public access to information. And this is not just a voluntary act, but there's some very important meanings making this information publicly available, as we've already heard from Roy. So thank you again for being with us here today. I would like to now turn it back to the panel and call upon Lisa Gaucher, who is the interim executive director of the Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative, and as that, uniquely placed to talk with us about seafood certification. But before we get started, I want to give a particular thank you to Lisa, because Lisa is based in Seattle, where it is now 5:30 in the morning. So thank you, Lisa, for getting up so early. I hope there is a strong coffee or tea in your cup. But maybe not everyone in the panel is fully familiar with what the GSSI is all about. So maybe you could briefly describe a little bit about the mandate of GSSI, but then outline for us where you see certification efforts, such as, for example, the Marine Stewardship Council, Friend of the Sea, just to name two of them. How can they stimulate government transparency when it comes to fisheries management?
Yes, thank you so much, Sven, and for the question, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this very important panel. As GSSI is actually based in the Netherlands, but as Sven mentioned, I am in Seattle in the US. So good morning, everyone worldwide. Thank you for your attendance. A little bit about GSSI. We are positioned we could say, in sort of a neutral space, trying to convene industry and NGOs and governments and various stakeholders around the world towards advancing an increase in sustainable seafood. And we do this through numerous mechanisms, but to briefly outline some of the major ones, one of them is our environmental global benchmark tool. This is quite a robust assessment process for certification standards. Certification standards apply to be benchmarked voluntarily. It is quite a robust process that has been developed over many years, indexed to FAO guidelines. And we partner with the FAO in developing it. And when they apply, if they meet the criteria, then they are publicly recognized. And why is this important? So for this environmental benchmark, there are many, many, many standards out there: first, second, third party, local, international. And over the years, the proliferation of these standards has created, I think, a lot of confusion. People not knowing which ones are credible, what are they based on, is it scientific, et cetera, and so forth. So the GSSI Global Benchmark Tool for the Environment was created to help alleviate some of this confusion and provide clarity and confidence. We also have a social benchmark in partnership with the SSCI to address similar types of confusion, and we work globally with our multi-stakeholder partnership and NGOs to advance awareness and the importance of sustainability and certification. So now, how does certification stimulate transparency? Well, I'll be building on some of the very important points that Roy and the ambassador made. Clearly, the biggest advantage to transparency and certification stimulating transparency are the economic benefits and incentives. It's quite easy, really, to make the business case. For one thing, certified seafood typically goes for a higher price, but if we step back and look at a broader landscape, as has been mentioned earlier, society and governments and various organizations around the world have become increasingly concerned about food insecurity. Clearly, you have to protect the resource in order to ensure that it's available for generations to come, in order to address food insecurity and also to protect the economic benefits that come from these resources. So if we look at the global marketplace and we look at buyers, particularly in major markets, there's a very strong increasing demand on the part of retailers and food service and importers and other major buyers around the world of seafood for proof that the supply chain can be trusted. And one of the mechanisms for proof, of course, is credible third-party certification. Why do they do this? Well, some of them do it because it's the right thing to do. They want to ensure that the seafood supply is not implicated in environmental degradation, depletion of resources, and we always have to tie to this the social aspect. So labor abuses and human rights abuses, proving that that's not part of the supply chain. Other reasons they do that, though, are the real pressures that are coming to bear from consumers. Consumers are increasingly concerned about where does their food come from, how is it being managed, is it responsibly produced, is it implicated in child labor and bonded labor and these kinds of things. Interestingly enough, during the pandemic, there's been a number of studies that have shown that this concern and awareness grew quite significantly around the world as consumers had to make choices about what to purchase and cook it at home because they couldn't go to restaurants anymore. And so this raised concerns about health and about where the food is coming from. And so these major global buyers also need to protect their brand reputation in order to keep the consumer confidence. There's also a lot of increased negative reporting about the seafood supply chain. We see a lot of in social media. We see reports published by environmental and human rights NGOs implicating the supply chain for environmental issues as well as social issues, as I mentioned earlier. One example in the United States was the highly controversial Netflix Seaspiracy documentary published in 2021, which got quite a few eyes on it around the world and created a lot of concerns about the seafood supply chain. So talking about the ties between certification and how it stimulates transparency and economic benefits, I think one of the best examples I can give of that is when I was in Japan last month. The government of Japan is kind of follows some of Roy's points, put together some major fisheries reforms starting in 2020, talking about improved management of the fisheries. And they put quite a bit of detail into that. Why did they publish that? Well, they also cited some very significant negative trends, reduction in production, reduction in demand, and reduction in export values. So how do we turn all this around? Because clearly seafood is critically important to the Japanese economy, to the food supply, and to their culture. So besides reforming fisheries management, the Japanese government clearly recognized that communicating what they're doing domestically and overseas is a critical part of being able to build confidence in their supply. And so they very clearly state in this published documents that eco-labeling and certification is an integral part of their plan for revitalizing the seafood industry and the economic benefits that come from that, which of course involves more jobs, higher production, and higher export values. So I think that the ties between certification and transparency and confidence are quite clear. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ida. It falls a little bit under this notion of do good and talk about it, which is it has to be on both sides. And also thank you for clarifying what GSSI is doing, because in parallel I'm always looking at the Q's and A's that we're getting in. And one question that came in from a colleague at the Vietnam Tuna Association is, that he stressed that, that there's so many certification efforts now ongoing. You don't really know, if one is certified, what does it mean? How does it relate to another certification effort? So I think GSSI, the benchmarking tool, can be of great help in these regards. But I want to go a little bit further down on the aspect you mentioned, and that is the confidence that is supposed to be given if there is a label on a certain product. And we have these certification efforts, and you can download, for example, the Marine Stewardship Council standard. You can see how they do this, etc. So the process itself is described. People understand what is in that particular process. But from your point of view, to try to bridge between the certification efforts and then government transparency, how much does it really matter if a certification effort is conducted in a country with a well-governed fisheries framework? So basically meaning, being transparent, as we have, for example, seen in the Seychelles. Does that really matter in the certification, or is that more of a nice to have side aspect, and really the focus is just on the certification process itself? I hope that makes sense. What I'm
yes, I believe so. Thank you. Well, I think that Roy and the ambassador made good points on this. Transparency leads to trust, and when it comes to the certification of fisheries or aquaculture operations, for example, lack of transparency naturally impedes the process of certification. Even if the information is readily available, but not publicly, that can be provided to a certifier. I think the lack of transparency would naturally lead to concerns about the robustness of the fisheries management regime, and make it more difficult to access the information necessary to properly assess the fishery and have confidence in how it's governed. So with zero trust, we have lots of other negative perceptions that go along with that. Perceptions, lack of public information, perceptions about potentially corruption, perceptions about inability to trust. Do these regulations even exist? If there is a robust regulatory system that is properly implemented and properly enforced, why is that not being publicly communicated? So it naturally leads to doubt about do they exist, to what extent do they exist, are they actually enforced, are they scientifically based, and so forth. So I think that lack of proper governance and lack of public information about this governance definitely leads to issues about lack of confidence in the seafood supply. Also, lack of confidence perhaps from government to government and in trade relationships and NGO perceptions. I think that it's very difficult and maybe even impossible to achieve certification, particularly the faster you're able to do it, the less it costs. So, naturally the cost rises as the complexity and difficulty rises. Example, also lots of negative publicity surrounding some of these regions with poor governance or lack of public information. A lot of implications and publicity about IUU fishing, for example, that sometimes is perceived to go along with this. IUU being not only illegal, but unreported and unregulated being a key. If we look at the assessment organizations that assess fisheries through publicly available government information, clearly they end up having to assess a fishery as either red or don't buy or caution or something like that if the public information that they're relying on is simply not available. And then we take a look at, as I mentioned earlier, some of the market forces with consumers and major buyers around the world. Buyers increasingly, it's a price of entry that before you can even get to, and I know this in my previous positions when I used to buy and sell seafood, I couldn't even get to the price negotiations and talking about volumes and all of that until I was able to demonstrate to these buyers that I met their requirements for third-party verification of the environmentally and socially sustainable supply chain that I was using. And so this is an important part of buyers' risk assessment. We go back to the fact that they need to protect their brand and their reputation. Otherwise, the consequences are quite negative for their businesses. So as part of their risk assessment, they would necessarily look at, in many cases, the governance in the regions that they're looking to buy supply, whether or not is transparent, whether or not is perceived as robust, in addition to what sorts of certifications or fisheries improvement projects they're involved in. So I think that the governance is very closely tied to confidence and certification efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. This is there's a lot of food for thought, and what I'm hearing, and I'm trying to constantly process all of that, is we have more the hard facts on the one side, and as Roy mentioned, information being in the public makes it easier and quicker and a bit more less costly to find the information and use it for certification efforts. Well, you also just mentioned the important point of trust and confidence, and I think one of the aspects that we need to continue exploring is how do we communicate better that trust level, because it's so much easier to go to a minister and persuade him of something where he said, oh, you can get 5%, less fees if you do this, than to say you're going to do this and it is seen as more trustworthy. So communicating these soft factors is quite challenging, yet this is something that you mentioned, this is something that Roy mentioned, this is something that the ambassador mentioned at the beginning about democratic participation, etc. So there's clearly some discussions needed on that side. So yeah, thank you so much for all that explanation. Let's bring in our final panelist for today, Mr. Márcio Castro de Souza. Márcio is the Senior Fishery Officer for International Trade and Secretary of the COFI Subcommittee on Fish Trade of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which is much better known by its short abbreviation FAO. Now, Márcio, we both were in Norway last week, where you, as the Secretary, convened over a very productive 19th session of the COFI Fish Trade Subcommittee. And again, congratulations for what I felt was a very productive and very successful meeting. And it was almost like, this was set up to happen, one after the other, because in the subcommittee meeting in Bergen, there was a lot of talk about reliable data, reliable statistics, but not only for managing national fisheries, to understand what is happening so that decision makers can rely on the best available information, but also the importance of reliable information to facilitate international trade coming from countries. So from your experience, how does credible national data actually does facilitate international trade?
Yeah, thanks, Sven, for the question, and good afternoon, Ambassador, panelists, attendees. It's nice to see many familiar names in the attendees list. And thank you for your question, Sven. I think it was indeed a very productive meeting last week in Bergen. And we had also GSSI, FITI there. We had also the Swedish government there. So it was quite interesting. And maybe before addressing your question in particular, I just want to mention something that the ambassador in her opening speech, she mentioned about transparency and democracy. And I was just going to remember all of us that fish is a shared good, is a common good. So we are dealing with a common good, and I think there is no better answer to understand the situation of production, of catches, of sustainability, etc., than dealing with transparency in fisheries. That's like a natural answer to deal with a common good. It's not particular belonging to country A or to country B or to country C. It's a common good. So by definition, there is no better answer than using transparency as the same principle as the ambassador mentioned in the Swedish constitution in terms of democracy to address fisheries in general, I mean, in particular, wide fisheries in the world. So I think that's a very associated and integrated message that we have to convey to ourselves. And indeed, during last week, during the subcommittee meeting, we had many, we have presented to FAO members, to FAO countries, 11 documents that cover a wide range of topics, as Ben mentioned, dealing with statistics, but also dealing with many country and private sector generated information, like catch documentation schemes, like the issue of food safety, like the issue of the economic effects of IUU fishing. And that's particularly interesting for many countries, particular coastal countries. So it was a very rich, I would say, meeting that indeed we had a very significant messages and guidance from countries to FAO involving the issue of data, the issue of the importance of free trade flows, and also the importance of sustainable trade flows. And in this regard, I just would like to also highlight that when going to your question about international trade and fisheries and transparency and all the associated interlinkages, I mentioned the issue of the fish being a common good. But in addition to that, when you talk about international trade, fish is also the most important animal protein traded internationally in value terms. So when you talk about fisheries, you are talking more than the combination, the value summit of beef, poultry, and pork in international terms. That's a lot. So that puts a lot of emphasis on international trade. And again, when you talk about international trade and the importance of fisheries, that also automatically leads to the importance of data availability. Not data availability in terms of the production and exports, of course, that's a natural one, but also in terms of the sustainability of the activity. Why is that? Because as Lisa mentioned, there is also in many markets already a natural demand for some specific labels or certifications or assessments that can be done by different sources for the sustainability of fisheries. However, in terms of this importance about the activity being sustainable and also the importance about government collecting data, we must take into consideration the nuances of the fisheries sector. And we have to take into consideration the importance of small-scale fishers in the production side of the sector. And that's something that FAO advocates a lot. We have a specific guidance addressing small-scale fishers. And in this regard, I would say that in terms of the topic of this debate today and the guidance that we have on small-scale sector, maybe the most important principle that I can bring from that guidance into our discussion today is that one size does not fit all. So when you talk about transparency, when you talk about fisheries management, when you talk about disclosure of data, etc., we have to take into consideration the nuances of the small-scale sector as it is. Take into consideration, really take into consideration the lack. Sometimes it's not going to be possible to apply the same rules for small-scale and industrial fishing, etc. And also, I just would like also to maybe to just over time now to finalize and to mention that particularly considering also this importance of small-scale fisheries and also the importance of developing countries in supplying this global export of fisheries and aquaculture products, we must say that there is a lot of importance of governance in general also producing reliable data, because sometimes the data is not going to be able to come from a small-scale fishery. It's going to be, it must come from the government because of lack of information, etc., at a global level, at a regional level. And that goes back to the SDG issue that definitely we have to focus on this agenda, this global agenda for 2030. And there is a specific agenda item that calls for exactly to assess the fish stock, which 14.4, and that puts more emphasis in the role of government in terms of bringing this data and this information publicly available. So I hope I could cover most of the topics of your question.
Perfect. And don't worry about the time. I keep an eye on it. I just want to to share that the little anecdote. When we were in Bergen, Marcio, as the secretary, had a small traffic light on top of his chair. So whenever somebody went over time, a little red light was circulating in the room. So that brought everybody to that. I think one of the reasons why the meeting last week was so successful is because of that particular time management. And again, thanks a lot. There's so much information. I'm really glad we're recording this session. One of the things that struck me when you mentioned is the data availability to understand a little bit better, and why trade data is also quite important. And one of the examples that I want to share is from the Seychelles, actually. When you look at a particular fishery like sea cucumber. In the case of the Seychelles, sea cucumber is not a big fishery. It's completely overshadowed by tuna. So if you look at the number of licenses, it's very little. If you look at the catch volume, again, it's very little. So if you apply a focus on, almost like a risk-based approach, when you just look at that information, you probably overlook such a fishery. But when you then add information about fish trade, and you see the enormous export value of that particular fishery, all of a sudden it paints a completely different picture, because then it shows you a sector that is low in volume and very high in return. And again, that is where I think the power of the data, I think, as we heard it last week at the subcommittee meeting quite often, is important. But sometimes, at least I feel, there's so much information out there, and you do get a little bit lost. So I know that you're not only working on the fish trade side and being the secretary of the subcommittee, but you're also working for or at or with Globefish, which is an FAO effort to bring more information about trade into the public. So how does the FAO, in particular with the Globefish effort, help countries and help stakeholders to understand a little bit better international trade agreements, the requirements for eco-labels, etc.? What is the FAO doing in that particular regard to, again, bring more light and transparency on the global level to that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And indeed, I'm also the coordinator of Globefish. Globefish is, in fact, it's the oldest project in FAO as a whole, not only fisheries. We are going to be 40 years old next year. Indeed, I would say that if you're thinking about availability of data, and if you think about transparency, I think we have the same DNA as FITI, as FAO, because, of course, one of our main motto is to provide information and data as a public good. So that's one of the things that we conduct in FAO, in particular in Globefish, but in many other FAO projects and areas. And one of the Globefish is basically, and the website is www.globefish.org. It's basically a market provider of information. So we make analysis of different species around the globe, in particular some particular markets like Europe, China, but also globally, for the around 30 species, the most one traded internationally. But in addition to that, and that's something that most of in many events that I participate, most of the people are not aware of the huge volume of information that FAO has associated with trade of fisheries and aquaculture products, associated with market prices. And that's, for example, those kind of data bank that can show what as Sven just exactly mentioned about. Of course, if you look at the overall scenario, for some countries, tuna is going to be particularly important, but when you look more in the details, you are going to have other species showing up. And for example, all of you are going to be able in the FAO website to browse for production statistics for all FAO members, trade statistics, export and imports divided by product. One information that we produce, which is quite relevant, is the border detention for fisheries and aquaculture products. So for the 4 main markets in the world, we analyze why fish has been detained at the border. It's because of histamine, it's because of label problems, it's because of any kind of problems. So again, the issue of information is becoming something very important in terms of assessing potential new markets, also assessing products that some countries produce, and in many occasions they are not even aware of the demand for this product in international terms. On the Globefish website, well, we have a product, what we call the country market profile, which shows it's a 3-page summary of the country in terms of the importance of fisheries to the country, but also shows what the country produced for fisheries, what are the major import products and the major export products. So in 3 pages, you have a very rough notion about the fish economic, the economic importance for the country, and also how the country trades. But in addition, I think, to the data, I think FAO has a series of guidance, and some of you already mentioned some of those. But I think it's particularly critical in terms of the legality and the transparency of fish products, and also the international trade of fish products. And I'm going just to highlight 2 of them because I think they are particularly important. And the most critical one, in my opinion, for every single fish activity is the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries of FAO. It's a quite old guidance. It's a 1995 guidance, but in practice, it covers all the value chain from the net to the plate. And it already, in 1995, it already talks about very recent topics, like, in fact, like eco-labeling schemes. It talks about the importance of any kind of controlling and management measure not becoming a barrier to trade. So these kind of elements are already present in a 1995 guidance that I must say that was also the year of the birth of the World Trade Organization, which is also so associated with trade. And the second item that I would like to call the attention is the port state measure agreements from illegal and regulated and unreported fishing. And that's a critical aspect too. So I'll just going back to Sven's question, I would say that the set of information and trying to link that with the overall purpose of the webinar in terms of transparency, and also bringing to the ambassador's speech about democracy and availability of information. And I would say that if you go to the FAO website in the area of fisheries, and we look the kind of information and the kind of guidance that we produce, we try already to facilitate a lot the work of governments towards fulfilling the basic needs in terms of transparency, in terms of making the fisheries activity sustainable in the long run. So that's something I think very critical, because I usually say that we do not have to reinvent the wheel, maybe just promote that the wheel exists. So I think that's an issue that maybe I think it's quite important. And I think we have here 2 partners that exactly try to promote the existence of this wheel from different angles, like the GSSI and FITI. So I think it's quite interesting, this kind of event. And again, I just would like to reiterate that please use FAO as a big source of information that can facilitate the work of governments, the private sector, academia, and others, in order to, first of all, check what are the main trends occurring in the fishery sector, but also in order to see and to try to cross-check what is your current situation in your country or in your fishery towards the basic guidance that we produce. So thank you, Sven.
Thanks, Marcio. I think one of the points that comes out of this webinar is that we're producing quite a few really nice punchlines. And we had transparency equals trust earlier. What you just said, promote that the wheel exists, I think is again, and it really nicely echoes also some of the questions that we're getting in. Now, I have tons of follow-up questions, and we're getting more and more in through the Q&A function, but we do have a limited time. So maybe 1 or 2 follow-up questions, and I'm trying to weave in some of the questions that we're receiving from the participants. So this one may be a bit more directed at Roy, but Lisa and Matthew, please feel free to intervene if you see. From your practical experience, Roy, what are some of the challenges that seafood exporting nations like the Seychelles face when they need to balance on the one side the economic benefits of fish trade? And again, you just mentioned there are currently 3 or 4 assessments going on to get certificates. You don't do these certificates just to have something on the product. You want to open market. So on the one side, you have the economic benefits that come with exporting fish trade, and on the other side, you have the sustainability of fisheries management. And I want to put that in the local demands, that may not so much rely on an eco certification. So how do you make that trade-off of international demands and national priorities?
Thank you, Sven. Well, one of the biggest difficulty that we face in this is that, yes, true that certification has its benefit, but on the other hand, it is rather costly and also takes a lot of time. Sometimes it can also be seen as acting like a non-tariff barrier to trade. I believe, just like Marcio has echoed, sometimes you also have to balance the trade-off between industrial and small-scale fishery. And most often, the same measure that is applicable to industrial fishery is applicable to small-scale fishery. And so often, those tiny small-scale fishery were not responsible for the state of the stock as it is, as it can be, and also are very unlikely to make a fishery unsustainable. But because the certification is the same across the board, it makes it very, very difficult for small-scale fishery who may not be able to penetrate the international market if they are not certified. And also for us, in terms of small island developing states, we may not have all the necessary resources to be able to assist those small-scale fisheries to be certified. So we believe, and like Marcio has said rightly, sometimes in small-scale fishery, the lack of availability of data also plays a crucial role. So for us, in terms of the transparency process that we have engaged with FITI in publishing data on the fishery as a whole, it may help in terms of trading as well. I don't know if I've answered your question, Sven, but for us, this is based on our practical experience in terms of trade-off between fisheries management, certification, and sustainability. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think one of the aspects, especially if we're looking at small-scale fisheries, because we've seen a few questions coming in on that level. On the one hand, obviously, the certification process will always have a certain length, a certain cost associated with it. But if government transparency can reduce a little bit the financial burden, because data is already there, it doesn't have to be looked up for, it's already credible, etc., and makes it less time-consuming, that there is obviously then a chance for small-scale fisheries to then also engage in these eco certifications. But then on the other hand, we always have to take this into account. If all the catch from small-scale fishers is shipped off for economic purposes, what implications does it have for the local demand that is there? So I think, again, it's always this trade-off that is there. But maybe one follow-up question to you, Roy, because I have like 3 questions here from Marta, from Subrata, and a few others. if there are benefits with government transparency, why don't we see more countries making that information publicly available? Is that a communication gap? Is there a mindset issue? I mean, I have my own view on that, and I may add that later on. But from someone who has done it, and it hasn't always been an easy process in the Seychelles, but you guys are very advanced now. But from your point of view, where is the issue?
I think the issue can be twofold. Firstly, it can be seen as a daunting task to open up to the public, to open your books to the world. And sometimes authorities may have the information, but it may not be in a centralized location. It may be patchy. It may be in different location and not easily accessible. But for us, from our experience, what we have seen when we went through this process, yes, it is a painful process. It is a costly process. It takes time, but it has allowed us to also have a clear view, a clear picture of exactly what are the data that we have and what are the data that we are missing. And by making it public, in fact, it has benefited us because it has allowed potential investors to see what are the areas that they can tap in. It has been able to put business together. So sometimes the fear might be about, if I open my book, I may become less competitive because others may know what I have. But for us, in fact, we are experiencing the reverse of this by being transparent. So I believe maybe this could be a lesson for others that are sitting on the fence at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roy. And I think, in addition to the, let's say, daunting task from an operational point of view, I think we have to acknowledge it's also a daunting task from a political point of view. I think one of the colleagues last week at the FAO meeting said, it does take political courage to engage in transparency. So I do believe, I think Marta was asking, is this a mindset, is it a lack of facts? I do believe that we need to do more about the positive hard facts of transparency, to convince other governments to engage in this particular point. So hopefully that webinar is supposed to trigger more follow-up aspects on this. But maybe more directed at Lisa and Matthew now. We're constantly evolving, and what is demanded now in some of the eco certifications, especially when it comes to labor rights, etc., was not on the plate a few years ago. So where do you see any emerging trends or innovations in either certification of seafood or also in international trade relations that have the potential to further trigger and incentivize government transparency in fisheries management?
I'm not sure if that was directed at me, but
both at you. I mean, obviously, Roy can also chip in, but whoever wants to go first.
Okay. Firstly, I'd like to say a little something about the transparency piece, and why maybe some governments or individual companies might hesitate to be transparent, besides Roy's excellent points. Speaking as someone that used to sell seafood representing Asian producers, as well as working, for example, with the Seafood Task Force in Thailand with the Thai government, trust is a two-way street. And so beyond what Roy said, another factor is the notion perhaps of what you say can and will be used against you. So, for example, the more transparent information they provide, not only especially from an individual company point of view, potentially jeopardize competitiveness and points of differentiation. But sometimes the more transparent you are, people look, organizations, NGOs, etc., look for holes or gaps in this information and use it as a point of criticism or attack. So there is a very real fear about data being used against them. So I think that is something that is important to mention. With regard to trends, I think there's a lot of trends. I think one of the things we're trying to do is, and other parties are also trying to do, is bring more of these global or international organizations together to work together more collaboratively, because there is a lot of duplication out there. There are different organizations working really on similar or even the same topics. This adds cost to the supply chain. And so we need to be more efficient. We need to be more cooperative in order to avoid this duplication. And some of the other trends that we see going on are things that I mentioned earlier. More and more pressure being brought to bear through the rapidly moving information age that we're in right now, on the importance of sustainability and transparency in the food supply, food security, trust, and protection of jobs and economic benefits. So with consumers and media and the marketplace, I really think that the amount of pressure is really rapidly increasing, and that's probably one of the biggest trends I would point to. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe just jumping in and maybe also starting with the issue that Roy just addressed. And I think just adding to your points, Roy, and I think maybe one important point to take into consideration is also for many countries, in terms of like a barrier to increase transparency, in my perspective, and again, that's completely my personal assessment, not FAO, but is the issue of where fisheries sit in the whole economy of the country. Because of course, many countries, they are very transparent in other economic sectors and not so much in fisheries. And that's also an issue of what's the sitting role in terms of the share of the economic importance of fisheries in the country economy as a whole, that can create an incentive for fisheries being more transparent or not. In terms of the new trends that can collaborate to increase all the issues that we have been discussing today, I would like to maybe to highlight one specific issue, which the new preferential trade agreements that are being signed between major countries or major trade blocs. Because usually trade agreements, they are very associated with a country that's part of the trade agreement. The country is going to pay a reduced import tariff when exporting to another member of the trade agreement. But and those rules, in order to obtain this tariff advantage, have been usually associated with economic patterns and also very strict trade patterns. But in the last maybe in the last 3 to 4 years, maybe 4 years, we have started to see non-traditional clauses being introduced in trade agreements that are directly linked to sustainability aspects. So nowadays, in the most recent trade agreements, in order for an exporting country to benefit of the reduced import tariff to another territory, the country has to comply, has to prove that the fishery that has been exported is sustainable, for example, or the fishery that didn't receive subsidies, or there is no IUU associated with the flag of the country. So there are not many new aspects being incorporated into clauses to grant the benefit of the reduced import tariff that are more associated with sustainability, with transparency of the exporting country. So this is a new trend that we are observing in the global markets. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew and Lisa. And so I'm going through the questions that we have, also keeping a little bit an eye on the time, and basically a few themes, just to bring them also up front. Is I think one of the key points is also terminology. There's a question about what do we mean with transparency? Also, what do we mean with sustainability? And I know that we struggle a little bit with that as well, because if you look at the FITI standard, it does try to address economic, social, and environmental aspects. But sometimes when you look at the eco certifications and their marketing the sustainability of fisheries, or their contribution to the sustainability of fisheries, yet in fact the main focus is on the ecological aspect of fish stocks, and aspects like equal benefit sharing are not really addressed in these efforts. So I think there's a bit more work to be done to make sure that when we're talking sustainability, we're talking apples and apples, or green apples and red apples, and not completely different fruits. There's a whole lot of discussion going on the cost side, both in transparency being a facilitator to bring costs down and opening up certifications to maybe more fisheries. So that's more on a positive note, but at the same time, also the costs associated with this, and not being able to get certificates and acting as a non-tariff barrier, as Roy mentioned. And third point, there was one point about how much is there already a linkage between government transparency, for example, what the FITI is doing, with certification efforts. And I think if there's one thing to be learned from that first study that has been published, I think last week, is that there is overlap, but more needs to be done. I think what has been highlighted so far are the positive aspects from that study, that a lot of people see it can be less time consuming, less costly if there is public access to information. But the study also shows that lots of organizations that are involved with certification efforts are not aware of efforts like in the Seychelles or in Mauritania or in other countries where information is being publicly made available. So again, that is an area where there is more work to be done. So I think on the communication side, there's more work to be done, but also on making sure that I sometimes have the feeling it's almost like a silo. You have the certification processes on the one hand, and then you have the government transparency on the other side, and lots of people talk about transparency, etc. But we need to do a bit more work on integrating these. So I don't know if there's any final thoughts or comments from our panelists on the few bits and pieces I just threw out looking at the Q&As. Lisa, I'm not sure if no, okay. So I would then, basically, the idea of the webinar was to really have a starting point for this discussion. So I think what has been shown is we need more work to be done on the link between government transparency on the one side and incentives coming from the market, either through eco certifications or through international fish trade. And I think from the discussions we had so far, we are off to a good start. So I want to thank, first of all, the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management to co-organize this webinar with us. And of course, a huge round of virtual applause to our keynote speaker, Ambassador Anna Lindstedt, to our panelists, Roy Claris, Isa Gaucher, and Marcio Castro de Sousa, and for all the participants who attended this webinar, for all the questions that were raised. We will look at the questions again afterwards, and if there's something we haven't fully responded to, we will do so afterwards. But with this, I have the pleasure to thank you all again and close the webinar and wish you a fantastic day. So thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.